Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Learning Biology with Dr. Vanessa. In today's video, we are going to discuss how you breathe. Of course, you've heard about and know about inhalation and exhalation, breathing in and breathing out. You talk about it when you learn about relaxation techniques or you exercise. But what exactly are those processes that are happening? The physiology behind it that allows you to do just that. In this video, we are going to delve into the mechanism of action that allows you physically to take in a breath, inhalation, and breathe that breath out in exhalation. In order to understand really how inhalation and exhalation work, we need to take a closer look at the lungs and how they are set up. In my last video, I went through the different parts of the respiratory system, but let's take a closer look at this. So if we take a look into this area here, which is referred to as the thoracic cavity, we'll see that this is the area where the lungs are found. Now, the trachea comes down into the thoracic cavity and branches out into the right and left main bronchus. They enter into the lungs. As they divide out, you can't see that here, but they get smaller and smaller and divide out into different types of bronchioles. And they are within each of the lungs. So there's two lungs, one on each side, right and left. You'll also notice that underneath the lungs is this muscle that is referred to as the diaphragm, which is very important in breathing. So this whole area right here in the thoracic cavity is a closed system. And that's important because in order to understand how we breathe, we need to understand that this is a closed system located in the thoracic cavity. The lungs themselves also have a serous membrane that surrounds it. The serous membrane is made up of two layers. The innermost layer that is closest to the lungs itself is referred to as the visceral pleura. The outermost layer is referred to as the parietal pleura. These two layers have fluid within them. It's a double membrane sac that is fluid filled, and so there is a bit of fluid in between these two membranes, and they surround the lungs, and this helps to protect the lungs. Remember, the lungs are doing a lot of work, expanding and contracting as you breathe in and breathe out. And so this membrane is going to protect the lungs, keep it from rubbing up against other things in the cavity, such as the rib cage or the heart that would be right in the middle. And this is to help protect the lungs. Let's take a look within the lungs itself. So the bronchioles, like I mentioned before, are going to continue to divide and get smaller and eventually become the terminal bronchioles and then go into respiratory bronchioles. So the respiratory bronchioles are going to enter into the alveoli. So each one of these is an alveolus. Plural would be alveoli. They make up these alveolar sacs that look like these grape-like clusters. And so for you to get a better understanding of how these work, these little areas that basically look like grapes and grape-like clusters is where the air needs to enter into. So it needs to get all the way down into these areas because this is where gas exchange is going to occur. So you can see they've put the capillaries here, and this is where oxygen is going to be taken into the blood supply, and carbon dioxide is going to be released into the alveoli so that it can be exhaled. And so it's very important to understand the structure of this because this is where the air has to get to. The air has to get to this end portion into the alveoli in order for gas exchange to occur. The definition of inhalation describes inhalation as the movement of air from the external environment through the airways and into the alveoli. Sounds simple enough, but how does this work? Inhalation occurs because of pressure differences. In order to move air from the outside into the lungs, the alveolar pressure, which is the pressure within the alveoli that we just talked about, has to be lower than the atmospheric or outside pressure. So how does this phenomenon occur? In order to lower the alveolar pressure, This has to be achieved by increasing the size of the lungs. This happens as the diaphragm contracts, it moves down, and it opens up the space in the chest cavity. We're going to get back to this idea, but before we do, let's take a closer look at Boyle's law, because Boyle's law describes the relationship between pressure and volume in a closed space. And we're talking about a closed space because I mentioned that before, that the thoracic cavity that we're referring to where the lungs are is a closed space. So let's take a look at Boyle's law and then we'll come back to how inhalation works. Boyle's law states that pressure and volume of a gas are inversely proportional in a closed space. Now that's important because the space has to be closed or this law does not apply. Therefore, if volume decreases, then the pressure increases proportionally and vice versa. Let's take a look at this idea visually. What you'll notice is that as volume decreases, pressure increases. Again, as volume decreases, the pressure increases. And this idea would be true the other way too. If volume increases, then the pressure would decrease. If you're still not understanding this, one of the best examples that I can think of is a potato gun. And probably you may know how these work, but this actually goes along with Boyle's law. Now there's a lot of videos you can watch on how they work, how to make them, etc. Some people get really fancy and make some crazy potato guns, but the overall idea is that you have a PVC pipe, okay? And you take that PVC pipe and you get some sort of dowel mechanism that's going to fit into the one end, and that's going to be used to push your potato piece, okay? So it's some sort of dowel system, and you want to make sure that what you put in there can easily be inserted into the PVC pipe and completely cover that area as you push down. And like I said, there's many different ways to do this. And then what you do is in the other end, you put a piece of potato. So you actually take your potato and you stick the PVC pipe into that piece of potato so that you end up with potato down at this end, okay? So you actually core it through and you have a piece of potato. And what's going to happen is that you're going to push this dowel in here. And as you push this dowel in, what you'll notice is that your volume is going to decrease, right? As you push this in here, your volume decreases, and Boyle's law says that as volume decreases, the pressure increases. So as we decrease the volume in here from the dowel to the potato, we're going to increase the pressure, and then what happens is that the piece of potato is going to fly out. And that's the same sort of idea that's going to happen within the closed system of our lungs, that as we decrease the volume, we increase the pressure, and as we increase the volume, we decrease the pressure. So now let's link how Boyle's law applies to inhalation. Inhalation is actually an active process. This means that there is contraction of muscles. The contraction of muscles are going to expand the volume of the chest cavity, and as that volume expands, it's going to decrease the pressure that's within the lungs. If we decrease the pressure within the lungs, then atmospheric pressure would be greater than alveolar pressure, and the atmospheric pressure would be able to be breathed in, so we could inhale. So air would then be able to go from the outside into the lungs because we make the pressure decreased within the lungs itself. The muscles that are active in inhalation are the diaphragm, which is the most important muscle of inhalation. When it contracts, it actually flattens and lowers down, and this helps to increase the volume within the thoracic cavity. It is responsible for 75% of the air that enters into the lungs. There are also the external intercostals, which are attached to the rib cage. Those muscles, when they contract, are going to help lift up the ribs. This also expands the volume of the thoracic cavity. This accounts for about 25% of the air that enters the lungs during normal quiet breathing. So again, since this is a closed system, when we contract these muscles in inhalation and open up the volume in the lungs, increasing that volume in the lungs, we decrease the pressure within the lungs, and that allows atmospheric pressure to come in during inhalation. There are also accessory muscles, but during normal quiet breathing, those accessory muscles don't contract. They are used during inhalation that would be happening during forceful, deep breathing. Once air enters into the lungs, then the pressure within the lungs is going to start to equilibrate with atmospheric pressure, and then eventually pressure is going to get greater in the lungs than atmospheric pressure, and this is what's going to cause exhalation to happen. So for us to be able to exhale, pressure within the lungs needs to be greater than outside pressure so we can reverse the process. Now, exhalation itself is normally a passive process, meaning there is no contraction of muscles. Instead of muscular contraction, the muscles are going to relax. The diaphragm is going to relax again, and it's going to become dome-shaped like it was initially. And the external intercostals are going to relax. So as the diaphragm relaxes and the internal intercostals relax, that's also going to decrease the volume within the thoracic cavity, and that's going to help to increase that pressure and allow for an exhalation. As you can hopefully see, breathing is a process that involves air pressure differences. There are 3 factors that we're going to talk about that can affect the rate of airflow and the ease of inhalation and exhalation. The first one is the surface tension of the alveolar fluid. The alveoli are composed of 2 different types of alveolar cells, type 1 and type 2. Type 2 are fewer, and they actually produce a detergent-like lipid and protein complex that is referred to as surfactant. This surfactant surrounds the surface of the alveoli and reduces surface tension of alveolar fluid and discourages the collapse of the alveoli. So why is this surfactant important? When we exhale, the lungs actually recoil, and the lungs are able to do this recoil because of the elastic fibers that are found in the lungs. They do this so that the lungs can actually maintain shape on exhalation. But there's fluid in the alveoli, and so if this were to happen without surfactant, the alveoli could potentially collapse. Imagine the tension being so great of that fluid that's not really moving on that alveoli, that could cause the alveoli to collapse when we exhale. But what the surfactant does is it helps to break up that surface tension, helps to break up those water molecules that are all hanging out together, and give the alveoli a little more buoyancy so that when we do exhale, the alveoli can maintain their shape and recoil and not collapse during that exhalation. Another factor that can affect airflow is lung compliance. The lungs have a high compliance. This means that the lungs and the chest wall are able to easily expand. This is related to the elasticity of the lung tissue and also the surface tension of the alveoli that we just spoke about. Imagine if there's scar tissue that starts to be formed in the lungs because of injury or something else. That scar tissue is going to have less compliance, and it's going to be harder for the lungs to expand easily. And finally, the third thing that can affect the rate of the airflow is airway resistance. The larger the diameter of the airway, the less resistance there is. And this is going to be regulated by the diameter of the bronchioles and smooth muscle tone. There's actually smooth muscle within the bronchioles, so they can dilate and constrict. So the greater diameter of the airway, the easier it is for air to come in. Remember, I also said that as we get closer and closer to the alveoli, the bronchioles branch off and they get smaller and smaller naturally. Imagine in asthma, the bronchioles start to constrict, which means they get smaller, and fluid also starts to fill in that area. Both of these things are going to increase airway resistance and make it harder to breathe. So if any of these three things are affected, that surface tension, something's wrong, maybe the alveolar cells aren't making the proper amount, or the lung compliance, like I mentioned before, there's scar tissue in there that's affecting lung compliance or something else. The airway resistance is increased. All of these things are going to affect how much oxygen we can take in, how effectively our lungs are working, and that's all going to affect the oxygen intake. When oxygen intake is affected, that's going to affect how much oxygen is able to be taken around the body to different cells. This can also affect our exhalation and our carbon dioxide levels, right? We want to maintain the proper oxygen levels, but we also want to maintain the proper carbon dioxide levels and not allow that to build up. We also want to be able to exhale that carbon dioxide as waste. Now that you've watched my video, you should have a better understanding of how both inhalation and exhalation occur. Think about the last thing we talked about. How can different things affect how we breathe? What happens when you're sick? What happens when your lungs fill with fluid? What would happen if that serous membrane that surrounds the lungs itself accumulated more fluid? How would the pressure change within there? How would the volume change? I want you to think about these things. If you have any questions or comments, please put them down below. Tell me what you learned. If you like the content of my channel and my videos, please make sure that you subscribe, click the notification button so that you never miss out on a new video, and be sure to like and share my content so that others can benefit too. Thank you.